inventory, monitoring, and mapping that we are doing in collaboration with within our own program in CNPS, and then broadly across a variety of different partners, agency and otherwise. So let's see. I need to advance the slide, hopefully. Oh, there we go. Whew, there was a delay. Okay, so broad view, as many of you know, that there are a variety of statewide programs in CNPS, and I would say the heart of the organization really are you all as chapters, and we as programs supply a different type of relationship to our organization of kind of collating and bringing together information from across the state, and then serving that and or supporting local initiatives. So us in the vegetation program, we interact with all the other programs of our statewide organization in a really collaborative way. And though sometimes we have our very individualized goals and objectives. So I'll be talking to you about some of those specific ones that we do and kind of just give you an overview of what we're doing right now in the vegetation program. I wanted to give a little bit of a snapshot of me. I'm not an original native to California, though I moved out here right before college, and I would say I gained a lot of roots and branches when I did my undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, and it was such a special place to go to school. And I had a natural history and botany focuses when I was a student there, and I had this really special senior thesis project with one of my fellow students, close friend, who we did a senior thesis project out in the desert looking at whatever was flowering at the time, and it was a drought year, but regardless, we found things flowering and did plant collections and botanical illustrations. So here's just a few to give you an idea of some of my artistic background that I don't ever get to do anymore, but someday I'll be able to get back to doing this kind of artwork. It was such a special project as I was becoming a budding botanist, I guess you could say, and really learning about the diversity of plants in California. So here's just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the plants I was able to draw when I was out there. In general, in CNPS, I work with a team of scientists, and that team varies depending on the collaborative projects that we work on and the mission and goals of the organization at the time. So here's just an example of where we were out in the field working on a project in the Sierra Nevada foothills and getting a variety of staff trained up on the different methodologies that we were implementing for one of the projects that we were doing. And in the center left is my colleague, Jennifer Buck-Diaz, who she's sort of, one of the co-conspirators of the vegetation program. And some of her main focuses are particularly in grasslands and vernal pool vegetation. We vary our team of scientists, as I was saying, and this was just last fall. We had a great team of interns and seasonal staff that worked with us on projects from across the state, whether that be in the desert to up to northeastern California. And it's been vibrant. So in the bottom right of this photo is Kendra Sykes, and in the middle is Jennifer Buck-Diaz, who are still on staff with us right now. And they've been working for CNPS for over 12 years, both of them. So we've been kind of like the stalwarts of the vegetation program. And then currently right now, we've got 2 field leads working in our program. The left-hand side is Kelsey Guest and Molly Wybush. And then on the right-hand side is Adam Haft and Savannah Vu. So those are some of the staff right now. And I'll give an intro of a couple of the others in a second. So in general, our vegetation program, I was hired on a number of years ago, and gosh, it'll be almost 20 years coming next year, where one of the one of the things that I did early on and have continued to do is help provide methodologies for vegetation sampling and to work across the state to support our understanding of the vegetation at the landscape scale across California. And then as we underscore what are the plant communities, what are the common plant communities, and what are the rare plant communities, and we do that through maintaining our what's called the Manual of California Vegetation, which is in a hard copy and now online publication. And we do a lot of this work collaboratively with a variety of other NGOs and local and state and even federal agencies, where we work on whether they be pilot projects or core eco-regional projects across the state. And then we also support chapter projects where, like, for example, we early on, we worked with the Santa Clara Valley to sample on Coyote Ridge and look at serpentine vegetation. And now we're working with other chapters and even graduate student classes and interns, both in our program as well as just, students across the state. So working to fill in and better understand what is the diversity of plant communities across the state. And then look at change over time as well. And we work on publications and then on core inventory projects around the state, including ones such as in the Greater Bay Area now. So this is just a little bit of other program goals. We teach plant science trainings in the past, and hopefully in the future, we'll be doing in-person trainings, such as, on the left-hand side there, showing one of the trainings that we give. And this fall, we're going to kick off a webinar that we're going to have next month. And if that one goes well and is successful, we'll hopefully kind of have recurring webinars to talk about what our protocols are and then how to utilize the tools that we provide online. And I will just say that we're working now, we were working on very key small scale projects, and now we're working on regionally based projects. So for example, we completed a project a few years ago across the Great Valley or the Central Valley to inventory and map the valley at a fine scale. And now there's even some remapping that's happening at a certain frequency that the Department of Fish and Wildlife wants to look at, how things are changing over time as well. So we're working on regional projects in different areas, including a new kind of like a budding project across the Greater Bay Area. And I'll talk about that some more a little bit later in the project. But I also just want to share one of the other special things that we've had a chance to do is to foster early budding botanists and ecologists. And this has been made possible through major donors, including the family of Aaron Espelin, for example, where we brought on an intern to work in our rare plant and vegetation programs, which was really a first time where we shared an intern across two programs that went back and forth every other month to learn vegetation and rare plant sampling techniques. And then she went out in the field with us in key project areas, whatever projects we were working on at the time. So that included looking at target rare plants in Southern California, developing plant lists for Utah River in Southern California, helping us process herbarium specimens from across different inventory and mapping projects that we had, and helping just learn, different techniques such as, what is the Environmental Quality Act in California and other opportunities that this person had. So it was a really great experience for her. And now she started graduate school in San Luis Obispo. And now we have a second intern working in our vegetation program exclusively, which is another great opportunity. A major donor of the Rice family, the husband of Barbara Rice, helped donate to focus in the region where they're from along the Mendocino coast to help the chapter in obtaining more information about rare plant communities along the Mendocino coast. And so this is another novel new kind of internship that we just have started to foster just this year. And Alexis is our first intern for this this program, and she's just a budding ecologist, and here she is pictured in the center here. And she's helped us collect new data, compile rare plant data from others locally, and helping to collect over 100 surveys already and document rare vegetation types. And it's been a really special, neat internship that, and then we hopefully she'll continue to stay on in our program. She just completed her undergraduate work recently, and so this is one of her first, her second, I guess, job right out of getting out of her undergrad. So it's been a really great experience for her, and especially in working with a local chapter on the ground. She started right before COVID hit and got out with the chapter and started a kickoff of vegetation sampling, and then a few months after we got COVID protocols, she got to get back out in the field with at least 2 or 3 core chapter members to continue that data collection of particularly in coastal prairie vegetation and coastal scrub areas where they know that there are vegetation types that are undescribed or poorly described, and they wanted to get a lot more data to help in defining some of the rare plant communities of that narrow strip of coastal vegetation that have been continuing to see impacts from things like development. So they want to better understand and then hopefully protect those plant communities. So let's see. Another thing I just want to do, like more of a shameless plug for a publication that we worked on collaboratively in CNPS that was called the California Botanical Landscapes. It was a really wonderful publication that we got to work on that was more of a pictorial view of the state's vegetation to talk about the diversity and the unique and or special parts of California. And we took an eco-regional approach. And here are 3 of the 4 of us co-editors on the upper left photograph of Michael Barber in the center left of the photo, who was the lead editor, and then my colleague, Todd Keeler-Wolf. And then while we were producing the book, our 4th editor, John Sawyer, passed away, so we dedicated the book to him. And it was a really special publication where we had 14 different co-authors and over 100 different photographer contributors to the book. And I'm just going to give a few photos for one chapter in a second here, but this just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the photographs of the book. And it takes a deep dive of prose of talking about why do we have so much diversity, and then what are some of the potentially, continuing impacts that we have to face in the different regions of our state. So this is just the first chapter, a few of the photographs from the first chapter. I'm not going to say much more. I just hope that if you haven't already purchased that book, please, I hope you do so, because it was a really enriching experience for me. I learned a lot from other colleagues about the processes and the patterns and the diversity of our state's vegetation. So this is just a little bit of a view from the North Coast region is where the first chapter is written from. All right. So hopefully if you don't already have that, you can consider getting that book. So now what I want to do is to talk about the work that was, I would say, really budding and started about when I came on staff of CNPS about 20 years ago, where we were starting to solidify protocols and processes for doing statewide vegetation inventorying and mapping at a fine scale as an integrated process. And I would say we've continued to hone and refine these processes over time. And some of them are really basic techniques, like just getting on the ground and collecting data and covering an area, whether that be 1,000 acres in size or 1,000,000 acres in size of a study area, but basically just getting on the ground and making sure we understand what are the different vegetation types that are clothing the landscape, And then as we collect data and compile existing data, then we bring it together and analyze data. And once we analyze what are the different patterns through that data that we collect, and then we interpret that information into fine scale vegetation maps. And then that mapping information gets translated into a lot of different uses, including conservation and management planning. I'll go into some of these processes a little bit, and how I'm going to do that is through some of the projects that we're working on across the state. But before I do that, I wanted to give a little bit of a background about vegetation, and just to make sure we're all on the same level playing field about what we think and say vegetation is. So this picture on the right-hand side that also came from our California Botanical Landscapes book is a nice overview that shows vegetation patterns in a kind of a bird's eye view. And it shows the distinct patterning, let's say, from the coastline to active dunes to dune swales, and then to and dune hollows, and then on into, as you go all the way out into the more stabilized dune where you've got coniferous, closed cone, pine, woodland, and forest. And so in general, vegetation, as you can see these patterns in the landscape, they're very observable, whether that be a bird's eye view or once you get out onto the ground. We can look at the plant species and how they're associating with themselves, whether that be the overstory plants and the understory plants. We can measure and record and quantify them. We can denote what's the species composition, the abundance values of each of the plants, and look at, well, what are the factors and the environmental drivers that are impacting why we see the patterns that we do in the landscape. And as we are understanding why and where those patterns are, we can work towards mapping them and monitoring them over time. And these vegetation patterns are very useful to get that on the ground information, and then a broad scale area that gets mapped at a fine scale, because they help provide information such as site quality or ecosystem function. And then they serve a variety of other purposes, such as getting an idea of what are the habitats for wildlife species, and how broad and common certain vegetation types or how rare vegetation types are. And in particular, as we are better able to understand those patterns and look at what is rare in vegetation, just like we can look at what is rare for a plant species, we can also help in providing information on even defending our rare plant communities just as much as we can help in conserving and defending our rare plant species, as we're working on quantifying and describing the plant patterns in the landscape. So in general, we have in CNPS, we share a set of protocols with a state agency called the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, so CNPS and Department of Fish and Wildlife. We work together on developing protocols for vegetation sampling, and those protocols vary depending on the goals of the project. And a lot of our goals right now are to inventory and map and to monitor vegetation. So we've got 3 different protocols that we use to do that. And this is my colleague Kendra out here. We were out last year collecting data out in the Mojave Desert to help in fine scale mapping in the Mojave National Preserve using these protocols. And our protocols include vegetation rapid assessment, which is a stand-based methodology. We have a plot-based, finer scale plot-based methodology, and then we have other things like reconnaissance and observation level-based protocols. So those are just 3 of the protocols that we use, as well as a 4th one that's a longer, more detailed monitoring, a set of monitoring protocols as well for finer scale, long-term monitoring over time. So we have a variety of protocols depending on the focuses of the project and the goals, and then what our main products and objectives are for the projects that we work on. And then a lot of what we do is collect data across the land to better understand what are the patterns, as I was saying, what are the vegetation patterns. And then as we collect in a mass, let's say hundreds, if not thousands of surveys, we then bring them in to a set of multivariate statistics to categorize and classify the associations and the assemblages of plants. And we do that and look at the plant species composition and the abundance and compare the vegetation across the landscape, and also understand why the plants are patterned in the way that they are. What are the environmental drivers of the plant patterning in the landscape? So just here is a good example of a picture. This is in the northern Sierra Nevada foothills, where we worked to do fine scale vegetation mapping. And now we're currently working on a project all across the southern Sierra Nevada foothills to make sense of the plant patterning in the landscape. And, as we look in a photograph or on the ground in the landscape, we work towards, looking at drawing lines and boundaries around, well, what do we see as the, what is different in this overstory of the vegetation, or so let me get my little laser pointer. Here we go. So here in the kind of like the center part of this picture is a blue oak woodland, and that is kind of like an open woodland. And then on these northerly facing slopes, it's even more heavily wooded and/or into a forest land with things like interior live oak or coniferous vegetation, and even the more mesic slopes up here. So we look at what are those plant patterns, and we collect data across all the different vegetation patterns that we see. And then we bring all those data points in and then analyze them and come up with a categorization of the plant communities. Let's see if I can get that pointer off now. Escape from pointer. How do I do that? Let's see. Oh, goodness. I don't know. Well, I won't worry about it. I'll just move it over to the left. Okay. So our vegetation categorization is compiled into a compendium. Our statewide system of classifying vegetation, as I was saying, is based on species composition or species presence and abundance. And we look at it floristically, like I was saying, blue oak woodland as one example, or interior live oak woodland are two vegetation alliances that we have described in our Manual of California Vegetation. This manual is partly quantitatively based and also has some qualitative description information and a set of maps that just show the range of each of the plant communities across the state. And we now are updating this manual that was in its second edition in 2009, and now we're updating it since 2015. We're updating it biannually online. And just to give a little bit deeper dive of our classification of vegetation, we in our vegetation program define and depict what our vegetation alliances and associations are. So the alliance and association are sort of like analogous to the genus and a species, if you're thinking of like organismal biology. So for the analog to organismal biology of genus and species would be alliance and association for our vegetation community classification. So alliance, when we look at alliances of vegetation, they're usually floristically based, as I was saying, and then we typically look at what's dominant or characteristic in the overstory, and then if there's not, if it's there's a tree in the overstory, we look at the trees first, and then if there aren't any trees, we look at the shrubs, and if there aren't any shrubs, we look at the herbs. And so that's a little bit of how some of the hierarchy is to some degree. But we look at, in general, though, what are the dominant plants in the landscape? And then like in this picture in the upper right, the dominant plant in the landscape is blue oak. But then in the understory, you can see wildflowers and grasses. So this would be a blue oak woodland with a herbaceous understory as the association. And that association is sort of like the smallest unit of our vegetation classification. And when we're usually doing our vegetation classification at the association level, it doesn't matter whether it's overstory or understory. We look at what are the plants and how are they assembling themselves in the landscape, and are they repeating in the landscape, and why are they repeating? What are the environmental drivers that are repeating these patterns in the landscape? So the bottom right is a blue oak woodland with wedge leaf ceanothus as another association on those slopes that you see on the bottom right. So in general, what I would say too, this is a little complicated, so I don't want you to commit any of this to memory, but I just want to say that we have a classification of vegetation that's hierarchical, just like in organismal biology. There's a hierarchy of plants or other organisms at the species level on up. And we have a classification system for vegetation as well, and we adhere to this as a national system of classifying vegetation. So we've got our own state system where we look at the finest floristic levels of a vegetation classification, which are usually based on the local plant species that are found in the local region, and usually based on local environmental drivers. And as I was saying, we look at that alliance and association level. But as you look more broadly above the alliance level up to the group, macrogroup and division level, for example, at the medium scale of our vegetation classification, those groups and above are based on not, at a more general level on the diagnostic species and general growth forms or life forms, the coniferous versus hardwood, for example, or whatever the life form might be. And it's usually based on climatic drivers that are more regionally based, like in the Western US, we have a different, set of climatic drivers as compared to the Midwest versus the Eastern United States, for example. So it's those regional drivers of climates for the medium scale of a classification. And then as you go even above in the highest levels of this national classification of vegetation at the highest scales, it's more really general growth forms and macro environmental drivers like, altitude and latitude, things like that. So I just want to give you a really broad overview. And so as we try to summarize, for example, at a medium scale, when we look at, in the West, we might ask questions environmentally at a group level that wouldn't be useful to always look at the association level when we have environmental and climatic questions. So the hierarchy is also helpful depending on the types of questions that agencies have as we are managing and conserving the landscapes over time. So as I was saying, though, our Manual of California Vegetation is updated online now, and that's the web address. And you can type in, for example, a plant name, whether that's a scientific or common name, and then hit the search button, and you can get potentially a list of or one or more vegetation alliances based on a plant species that might be of interest to you. Or you could do an advanced search by clicking on the advanced search and look at, and there's like a species search, and you can see what vegetation types are defined by different plant species across the landscape too. And so this manual is just kind of a quick snapshot of one of the pages of the alliance description, such as this is a leather oak alliance, for example, that shows you a quick snapshot of our main page of what you get once you get to the alliance description. I'm just doing a time check. Okay. So seeing the patterns in the landscape is really important, as I was saying. And these patterns, this gives you a depiction of that group level and the kind of like a little bit broader than alliance, where you can see that there's more than one different type of chaparral, where we define this just as chaparral in general on these steeper, dry slopes. And then only at the finer scale at the alliance level would you get that, oh, this is a Quercus dorata shrubland alliance, and that's a serpentinite endemic alliance that's often on cool slopes versus a more commonly found on and off serpentine, Big Berry Manzanita with chamise, for example, in the dry south-facing slope versus the cooler, moister, and serpentine north-facing slope. And so we're looking at these plant patterns as we are inventorying and mapping the plant communities over time. And this photograph is from Coyote Ridge. I think it's a great photo to show the plant pattern and how we diagnose the landscape. And then each of these areas that we have sussed out as plant patterns, then we would hopefully survey and then map these different patches of vegetation that you see here. One thing that I wanted to say, though, is that everything that you can see on the ground, sometimes it's not that easy, though, as we develop a vegetation map to depict it in a vegetation map. So this is an example in a serpentine and on and off serpentine in Marin County as a good example. This photograph shows you on the kind of like the left-hand side. Over here is an endemic manzanita called Mount Tamalpais manzanita that's found only in Marin County on serpentine. And it can get translated in the map here as the Arctocephalus montana vegetation type. And there's two different, one or more polygons that got mapped, and usually it's mapped. There could be more than one polygon that gets mapped because there might be a difference in percent cover in the different patches, and based on vegetation cover, we might split even different polygons. But in general, what we can see on the ground, usually you can see here is mapped in the GIS as we translate that into a full-on vegetation geographic information database that of translating that information from what we can see on the ground into translating it into a geographic information system of information across the entire landscape here. But then some other vegetation types aren't that easy to map, let's say at the alliance level. So this is a good example here where we have herbaceous vegetation that's off of serpentine. This is on serpentine here, where there's upland serpentine grassland, and that was translated to upland serpentine grassland, but they couldn't map the alliance. You know, there's different alliances that are found on and off of serpentine of herbaceous vegetation types. This one being Stipopulchra, for example. They couldn't, across all the areas where they were mapping herbaceous vegetation, could they denote the vegetation alliances. So they went usually up a level in the hierarchy of our vegetation classification. So for example, off of serpentine in the non-serpentine areas, there is a lot more non-native annual grasses that are strongly dominant. And so they were able to map at the group level, for example, in this vegetation map here. So they could translate it at the group level, but not at the finest scale of the vegetation classification, but they could reliably, regularly map at the group level in this region where mapping was occurring. So in general, we've been working around the state doing on-the-ground baseline data collection and fine-scale vegetation mapping. And so I wanted to give you a kind of like a quick overview of 4 different project areas where we've been doing that work. I also just want to say that this map here shows the state, and this was updated, I think, as of about a year ago. So there might be a few more mapping areas where there is fine scale vegetation inventory and mapping going on right now. But in general, about 60% of the land mass, or a little bit more, of California has been mapped to some degree or another at a fine scale. A lot at the alliance level and or at the group level. And these maps have been, and fine scale vegetation sampling has been occurring through a partnership of a lot of different state and federal and local agencies that are supporting this work. And here on the left-hand side are just some of the projects that we're currently working on in our CNPS Vegetation Program. And I'll give you a tour, a very brief tour of just 4 of those that we've been working on collaboratively with other partners. So the first one I wanted to give you a really brief overview of was in the Modoc Plateau and in the adjacent Northwest Basin and Range. So here kind of gives you this kind of is an overview of the very northeastern edge of California is where this project area is that we've been starting to do a vegetation mapping, and the funding has come primarily from the Department of Fish and Wildlife from their Region 1, and then some funding from the Bureau of Land Management, where they are working towards managing the landscape for sensitive and threatened and endangered plant and animal species, including one animal species being sage grouse, where they are working towards better restoration and management planning. And so vegetation maps are really important for the work, land management of those state and federal agencies. And so in this northeastern part of the state, the partners on this project include Geographic Information Center from Chico State and Aerial Information Systems, who are the vegetation mappers on these projects. And then the Department of Fish and Wildlife and CNPS have been supporting that work through helping them do data collection and or categorization of the vegetation types that then those other mapping partners work towards the detailed fine scale vegetation mapping. So this project area, similar in that integrative approach that I kind of gave you in the overview. So this project started in 2016, 4 years ago, of getting on the ground and collecting data. The data that got collected, I think there were about 800 surveys between 2016 to 2018 that we collected collaboratively. And then we pulled together a set of over 1,200 other surveys that other agency partners collected for a variety of different reasons, but in particular, U.S. Forest Service and the NRCS and the Bureau of Land Management collected a variety of data for inventory and monitoring and management planning in this area already. And so we brought together around 2,000 surveys in this study area. And then, as I was saying, we analyzed the data to come up with a categorization of the plant communities. And this is a diagram here that shows the plots that got collected. Here is like plots. All these are ponderosa pine samples that were collected, and these all grouped out in this cluster analysis as a one type of vegetation analysis technique that we use to group together similar plots based on plant species composition and abundance values. So here are all the similar plots of ponderosa pine, and those are one grouping of one plant association, for example, that grouped together. And these are in different color codings, shows you the clustering of the different plant communities at the association level. So we did vegetation sampling and classification analysis, and then translated that into a vegetation hierarchy, as I was saying, from the class at the highest level on down to the association level. And so this just gives you an example of two different vegetation types that were defined from this project area, and related in the related macro group of the intermontane tall and dwarf sagebrush shrub steppe macro group. And then so this, I want to say, by doing this project, what we were able to do is better understand the plant communities of that ecoregion. And we've been sampling and mapping, I would say, about half of that study area has had funding in the last 4 years to do baseline data collection, classification, and mapping with support from those agency partners. And based on that, we've been able to better understand and the vegetation community types in this region of the state where before we had a general view of the vegetation types, and then we've been able to fill in the data gaps. And so, for example, this vegetation alliance and association is one type that we added to our statewide vegetation classification based on this project. And so we added, I think, at least 4 different vegetation alliances, and I can't remember exactly how many associations, but we also redefined some vegetation types based on this project area, and combining sometimes vegetation alliances and or splitting vegetation alliances. But this just shows you some of the work that we did is to better understand and define vegetation types, this being a rare vegetation type for this part of the state. So this is some of the other products that come out of our fine scale vegetation classification and mapping projects include a set of vegetation descriptions. These descriptions are really useful for all of those products to know, well, when we mapped, for example, Western juniper woodland, this forms the description for that vegetation alliance. And usually these descriptions, they show things like, here are the general plant species that are found in the vegetation alliance, and here's the range in cover values, and this is the general average cover for each of the plant species that are typically found in that vegetation alliance, and which ones are most constant are depicted as well. And so these set of descriptions go with every vegetation project, and as well a vegetation any vegetation types that get redefined, and or the different associations that we might describe that come out of the vegetation project that we work on, then get served up on our online vegetation manual. And so this just shows you, this past fall, we about 2 times a year, we serve up the newest, most information from the inventory and mapping projects that either we work on or other groups work on, that then we induct in and synthesize that information. And so this is an example of that vegetation type that we just recently added to our statewide classification, for example. And then also our state partners at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they also serve up the lists of our plant communities. And this is through the wildlife habitat branch of the vegetation classification and mapping program, and they serve up online, as you can download the lists of our plant communities, whether that be in a PDF or an Excel. And this is just like a little snapshot of the PDF list of the plant of one snapshot of one of the pages from the list of the plant communities that are known to occur in the state of California. And this is, organized by life form, so tree, shrub, herb, and then this is a snapshot from the shrubland part of the classification, and then organized alphabetically by scientific name. And then also in this plant list, it shows which the rarity ranking of the plant communities as well, with global and state rankings if we have the global ranking and state ranking. So those are some of the products that come out in the list, so that everyone knows what are the different plant communities that occur in the state, and descriptions thereof. And then the mapping that occurs at a fine scale, this is just like one snapshot from the study area in the Modoc, Plateau, and Northwest Basin and Range. So just in this this is a little zoom in here, right here, from this little area of the greater ecoregions where we're mapping. So when we're mapping the vegetation, as I was saying, we are mapping usually at the alliance level, and in this we were afforded to be able to map even at the association level if we could reliably and regularly map at the association level. So here is a kind of like a snapshot of that mapping product. And then I just want to say, even a finer zoom in, here is a polygon, one polygon. And I just want to say, of every one polygon, it has a lot of information embedded across a vegetation map. So as I was saying, we're usually mapping the plant community types. And so this, for example, is a Western juniper polygon, and there might be more than one Western juniper polygon. And this, as a good example, this shows the vegetation type in that polygon, but there are a whole set of mapping attributes per polygon in these vegetation products that get produced. And the different attributes include things like vegetation cover, height of vegetation, disturbance characteristics or impacts, and then other kind of broader view attributes like what is the higher level groupings in the National Vegetation Classification Hierarchy, for example, and then other very specific map attributes that the users wanted to get out of it. Like they wanted to know in any and every polygon if there was juniper present, because they're doing a lot of juniper restoration right now across this mapping area. So each map that gets produced at a fine scale has any number of attributes. This is the set of attributes from this mapping area. And then the serving of all of the different fine scale maps gets served through our state agency partner, our California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They are serving the information, all these fine scale maps. This is just showing the Modoc Plateau, for example, of information. And you can query on there's a little query box, and you can query vegetation, or you can query a location and see what exists of the fine scale maps. Not to say that there aren't other locations where you can get coarser level maps. This is where you can get fine scale vegetation maps. So that's one of the project areas that we're working on. I have a few others that I'll try to quickly go through. This being another project area where we're doing fine scale vegetation mapping with the Bureau of Land Management as our partner. And in this project area, similar to the Modoc, but this is a much smaller project area where we are looking at two different fire areas that the Bureau of Land Management was wanting to know more about how fire has impacted the vegetation in these two different locations, in the upper right being the Chimney fire area and the bottom being what's called the Erskine fire area. And this is in the southern Sierra Nevada, just above Lake Isabella is the project area where we have been working over the last couple of years on this project. In this project, similarly, we're looking at understanding the plant patterns across the landscape in the post-fire landscape. And also we were looking at pre and post-fire as well. And so they wanted to know, well, what is in the landscape now post-fire? And so we set up across a monitoring array of the different plant communities from early seral vegetation, like early seral herbaceous and shrubland vegetation, all the way across to hardwood and conifer vegetation. So we set up a monitoring array, and then we also collected additional complementary vegetation samples from our different protocols that we use, and then a whole assortment of other quick observation level reconnaissance surveys to understand what are the different plant community patterns across these two fire areas, mainly though on the BLM lands because the funding came from BLM. So in this area, we're looking at two, also we were targeting and mapping two specific plant community types for the funding that was available at the time over these last 2 years, one being pinyon and juniper woodlands and the other being oak woodlands. So in this Chimney fire area, we did pre-fire mapping from using aerial imagery to depict what is present of pinyon juniper and what is present of oak woodland. And so in this study area of about 1,200 acres of conifer, pinyon, and oak woodland, we mapped in pre-fire, and then we mapped currently in post-fire what is now present of those same plant communities. And what we found is that fire significantly impacted the pinyon juniper woodland in this landscape, which is not a typical plant community that can survive in fire. And it will take any number of years, from 50 to more than 100 years, for that plant community to come back after fire. And then we also looked at the oak woodlands, where there wasn't much of a change, and if not much of a change, there was even an increase in one of the plant communities because it was maybe occurring in the landscape with the pinyon pine, and now that the pinyon pine is no longer there, it has released that oak woodland to be in the overstory now, and so we've now mapped where that oak woodland community type is. in that landscape. So that was one of the study area sub areas where we're doing fine scale pre and post fire mapping. And then this is the other in the northwestern part of Erskine, where we mapped oak woodlands, including Quercus douglasii, Wislizini, and chrysolepis, or blue oak, interior live oak, and canyon live oak. And so in this sub area, we had about, I would say, around 800 acres of oak woodland. And in that 800 acres of oak woodland, of those three different plant community types, the fire impacted the blue oak woodland more than it impacted the interior and the canyon live oak woodland, as can be seen in this graph here. And we'll be working over the next year further with the Bureau of Land Management to look at other products that we'll be working on with them, at looking at why we're seeing those impacts and helping them in setting some restoration targets. And we'll be looking at some of the impacts in the landscape, such as invasive species and other impacts over the next 1 to 2 years as we're continuing that project. So that's just a quick snapshot of that project. Another one that I'm not going to go into much detail, but that we have an ongoing multi-year project, is in the Carrizo Plain National Monument, where we've been working collaboratively with the Bureau of Land Management and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as our organization, to inventory and map and now monitor the vegetation community types over time. The initial baseline mapping started in 2005 to 2007 when we did the baseline vegetation mapping. And then we've been, over time, every 5 years, doing baseline and then monitoring over time in long-term monitoring plots. And we have, we're just now, last year and this year, we're doing our third subset of monitoring every in our third subset of monitoring every 5 years. So when we did the sampling and classification, we collected an array of sampling points across the different community types. And this is an area that we didn't know much about the plant community. So we had an intensive amount of data collection when we put together our sampling array. And we found an assortment, a diversity of vegetation types just across this. It was at 240,000 acres of land in this area, where we found in 240,000 acres over 50 vegetation alliances and over 80 associations. And in that area, once we worked in that area, we found and described, based on this, doing this baseline inventory and mapping, 6 new alliances that weren't previously described for the state. So as we're working on these inventory monitoring projects, we're filling in data gaps and better understanding that diversity of plant communities as we're working in these different project areas. And this just shows the fine scale vegetation map that got produced. And then what we did more recently is we looked at change over time. There was even a previous map 15 to 20 years prior to the baseline data collection and mapping that we did, and we were helping BLM better understand what are the changes over decades of time in the plant communities that occur in this Carrizo Plain National Monument. And then as we're also looking at change over time through long-term monitoring, and we set up a sampling array over a variety of the different plant communities, from the juniper woodlands to the shrublands and herbaceous plant communities. And this just shows a little diagram of the setup of our long-term monitoring. It's a 400 square meter plot, 100 square meter plot, and 8 1 square meter plots as quadrats, so sampling and subsampling within. And we stratified those plots across the different plant communities, and we have 5-year sampling and this ongoing restoration monitoring that we're doing. And so this is just showing some of the monitoring. We also did some even finer scale monitoring with other funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, where we also looked at grassland monitoring and change over time. That helped us better understand that even there's a lot of annual and interannual variation in plant communities. So this just showing two vegetation alliances, the Lasthenia californica, Californica gracilis, Plantago erecta, Vulpea microstachys alliance is one of them. And this just shows across all those different sampling periods, wow, what a change over time just in photographs. And then this is another, the Monolopia leptocyane alliance, and the change over time. And a lot of this variation over time is especially explained by variation in rainfall over time. So you can see a real dip in the richness of plants and the cover of plants. Also, these bars show the rainfall. So this being the lowest level of rainfall across the years that we were sampling, and as we had the almost like complete drought condition, there was very little, if any, germination of plants in those drought years. So what we found is that we don't recommend, there's not a good representation if you're going out in a drought year of those plant community types, and that we recommend multi-year sampling in these semi-arid areas such as the Carrizo Plain if you want to get a basic representation of the plant communities in these areas. And Jennifer has a whole talk just about this variation in plant in monitoring over time. So I don't have time now to go over that, but she gave a great kind of presentation to the chapter council, I think about a year ago, about this long-term monitoring that we've been doing. And then lastly, I want to cover the Greater Bay Area really, really briefly. Gosh, what time is it? Where am I at? So I'm about almost an hour, but I do want to give this because this is in your area. I want to give the next 10 minutes or so to talk about the regional mapping and inventory that we've been doing in the Greater Bay Area. It got kicked off by working with a group of federal and regional and local partners in Sonoma County. The Sonoma County Agricultural and Open Space were primary funders, as well as Sonoma County Water Agency, to do fine scale vegetation mapping across the entire county of Sonoma. And when we were working on kind of developing the scope of that work, they selected a mapping firm that was local called Tuckman Geospatial LLC. And Mark Tuckman, who's the head of that firm, is an amazing geospatial mapper who brought in some really sophisticated techniques of doing semi-automated mapping techniques to define plant communities at a regional level and medium scale mapping, as well as fine scale mapping, as well as a variety of other mapping products that came out of this work. And this was I would say like a gold standard that is now set up in the state of a whole suite of vegetation inventory and mapping products that get set up. And so I would say that Sonoma County is the start of this, and then from that work, they've also been able to bring in other data sets post-fire, for example, after the 2017 Nuns and Tubbs fire, for example, that severely impacted a variety of different portions of that county. And then they brought in other geospatial data sets to look at impact of things like soil burn severity and a variety of other things post-fire even too in Sonoma County, because they're looking at how to best monitor and conserve their plant communities over time. And so this vegetation map provided a lot of inputs towards their continued land management and conservation planning in that county, and continuing now from that area on into the Greater Bay Area now that we're working with a variety of other governmental agencies, as well as local landowners and just local land managers as well. And so we're trying to do I would say a county by county approach now utilizing some of these more sophisticated processes that came out of the Sonoma County Vegetation Mapping Project. And so now we're working at looking at how we can do these vegetation mapping projects, not just at like a project level, whether it's a water district, but at a county level now. And, what we found is that, we're working in different counties, including, I would say right now, like Marin and San Mateo counties are two other counties that we're working on, as well as portions of San Francisco County, to do the same level of inventorying and mapping that Sonoma County had. And I'll go into some of the details of what those procedures are, but I just want to say that we're working in these two counties now actively. We completed the Sonoma County project in 2017, and right after that project was done, we kicked off mapping in Marin and San Mateo counties and portions of San Francisco County. And now we're wanting to work in Santa Cruz and Santa Clara County. And we're just now kicking off those two county level projects. So what I want to say though is that as we're working in these different areas, what we're finding is that there are maps that do exist in these counties, such as Marin and San Mateo. A lot of those maps are really outdated. There are maps from 20 plus years ago where there's lots of changes over time, or they're not at the same scale, or they're inconsistent in how the vegetation types got mapped and the different, I would say, kind of like project level work that was done. So as we pulled together the existing vegetation maps, we're now kind of synthesizing what was known in the past, and we're now putting down and putting out in a sampling array to fill in the data gaps of plant community types that we know we haven't sampled as well yet. And so even though we might have a good sampling array in some counties, we still fill in the gaps through vegetation data collection, and then pull that back in together, and then use some more sophisticated techniques to do vegetation mapping and other products that I'll show you here. So as we are working in these county level maps, we are continuing to try to work across the entire Greater Bay Area to fill in the gaps and have a consistent map across the Greater Bay Area, hopefully over the next few years, is one of the goals that we have. So as I was saying, we're working in San Mateo and Marin counties right now, and then we hope to continue to work over the next 3 to 5 years in Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties as the supporting agencies and other groups come on board to help helping in the funding of these county level projects. So this just shows you an example of the fine scale product from Sonoma County, which is where the more recent work that we've been doing in the Greater Bay Area has come about. And this just shows kind of like a medium scale and then the finer scale, and this work that was done from medium to fine scale, from the life form of what is like, there are about 20 different categories that they mapped at the life form level. And the life form are things like where are different agricultural units, whether it be pastureland versus vineyard, or some of the units to what is the forest versus shrubland versus grassland. So kind of like really basic life form. And then drilling down deeper in from life form is the finest scale level, which was either alliance level mapping and or a group level, depending on how we could reliably and repeatably map the vegetation community types. The other work that is being done in these county level projects now, based on a lot of other data sets that are being collected at the same time, to create a suite of landscape level products. And these products are here are some of the ones that are being depicted that are being generated from this data-rich county-based initiative with a variety of different partners that are helping to fund this work, from the USGS and other counties that are helping to fund things like the LIDAR based and other really high fine scale 3 and 6 inch imagery, true color imagery are some of the products that are getting produced, to digital elevation models, height modeling, hydrogeographic information that comes out of them, pervious and impervious surfaces, for example, wildland fuels, canopy densities, and then ultimately fine scale vegetation mapping that gets produced from these fine scale maps now that we're doing in these semi-automated mapping projects that we're now working on. So this just shows you what existed before. For example, Sonoma County had some modeling of fire and fuels, fires and fuels data, and then risk assessment. And then this shows you the much finer level and scale of detail of the wildlands fuels modeling that came out of the vegetation and fuels modeling data that resulted. And once this modeling and fuels and risk assessment was produced, this was produced before the Nuns and Tubbs fire swept across the landscape. And so CAL FIRE was able to utilize where the fire would come through. And so it was amazing that this information could quickly help serve to the purposes of CAL FIRE at the time, to help in deciding where they should be moving communities of people out of those regions and out of safety and harm's way as the fires were impacting these areas. So the vegetation products were significantly useful for many reasons, including for risk assessment. But what I want to say is that we're the same project protocols that we had for the projects that I just talked about. Those are the same protocols that we use, but there are even more sophisticated protocols as well. But I just want to say we still get on the ground and understand the variation in the landscape, and collect vegetation data, reliably map what we see on the ground to try to then, in aerial view of the vegetation, in the imagery, then we map the different plant community types through an aerial view as well. And that linking of what we can see on the ground to an aerial image to a vegetation map. This just shows you, for example, in Marin County, where we're working right now, all the data that we pulled together from existing and new data collection that we pulled together from Marin County based on where we could get access. The most amount of access we got obviously is on state and federal lands, and then wherever we could on private lands, we collected data and classified the information. And this is just like a portion of the classification from that salt marsh vegetation that I showed from the photo before. And then we wrote a vegetation key to key out all the plant community types, and we're writing vegetation descriptions as we speak right now. We've got our ecologists working in the office writing vegetation descriptions. And then the mappers are getting on the ground and doing additional vegetation reconnaissance and validation field trips to add into the knowledge base to help in the training data for the information that they need for the vegetation mapping that they're doing. And then as we're doing these vegetation projects, as I was saying, we're learning as we go, even in the classification. We're still, even in a data-rich area that we had in Marin County, we're still helping to define and refine our vegetation classification. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but just to say that we're sometimes splitting alliances and sometimes merging alliances, and even at that finest level of the alliance level, we are better as we're working on these eco-regional projects where we're pulling together thousands of surveys. We're then refining our classification system, sometimes refining it, and sometimes adding some complexity in of the different plant community patterns. And so as I was saying, in this county-based approach that we're taking, we're pulling together a lot more information because of the new wave of data of different, for example, imagery data sources that we have, whether that be Landsat, throughout multiple years or throughout the year in multiple intervals and multi-temporal, for example, or high resolution imagery, and then different other ancillary data sets. And there's image analysis of all these different data layers, whether that be true color imagery or color infrared imagery, or other multi-temporal that get analyzed through a set of sophisticated processes. And then they look at, for example, over time as well. And then look at things like, excuse me, topographic variation and hydrologic variation, and bring all that information in and stack that information as a set of geographic information variables that then get brought together through a classification and regression and machine learning that is now done through a sophisticated set of techniques that Tuckman Geospatial have been working through a set of processes in GIS. And then they through that machine learning can produce those life form level maps all the way through to the fine scale maps that are getting produced. And then once the life form and the fine scale maps are produced, then they have to go in and do manual editing of information. And this just shows one of the mappers in doing that finer locally based manual editing of the GIS maps that get produced. And then we get back on the ground and test the accuracy of those vegetation maps. So this is just kind of to show you, for example, Marin, kind of like a portion of Marin County. And then this is the life form to the fine scale, to the fine scale mapping of Marin County. And then I'm not going to say you need to commit any of this to memory. I just want to show you the detailed process that they take through the sets of imagery and the LiDAR products and the ancillary data that run through a suite of different machine learning processes through their workflow, for example, to do the fuels layers workflow, and then the fine scale vegetation mapping workflow. It's a highly sophisticated set of techniques that they have developed in this county level effort, which takes time and a lot of data and a lot of money as well. But thankfully, there's been a lot of local and state and agents and even federal partners that have been supporting these projects. So, and also these fine scale mapping projects have been made more effective, cost effective, because of the imagery and the data processing over time there, because there's now LiDAR that's being done across the state. It's becoming cheaper to collect the LiDAR data and the processing of the data and implementing even though there's machine learning. They're learning as each project gets done, they're learning and developing those classification trees that and the automation techniques that we're learning and developing a lot of economy of scale over time through cross collaboration. And this is just an example from Marin County. Here's like the hydrogeography, and then this is the life form level mapping. So in summary, for these county level projects, and this is what we hope to be doing, for example, in Santa Clara and Santa Cruz counties in the years to come, but this is what we're doing right now in Marin and San Mateo counties. So this is what are some of the products that are getting produced just now. Over the next year or two, we will have a fine scale vegetation map at a fine scale with a quarter to half acre minimum mapping unit. And we estimate about 90 to 100 vegetation classes. And then there's all these other products that come out of it, everything from a digital surface model, digital terrain modeling, hillshade, contours, really detailed contours, impervious, pervious surfaces, wildland fuels, and then other products that are getting produced that are user defined from the local agencies, like percent mortality and sudden oak death mortality, for example, and hydrologic system mapping at a much finer resolution than what exists at the national scale, and tidal wetland mapping. And then here are just some of the utilities of these very intensive fine scale mapping and modeling that is now being done at the county scale. So this just shows you some of the applications of these fine scale maps, from climate change adaptation to flood risk assessment and management, to, as I was saying before, wildfire planning and response, to now even cannabis mapping, for example, in the Greater Bay Area, and restoration planning. So hopefully we just this summer, fall, kicked off some of the groundwork, I would say, to do the work needed for in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Through the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network is a partnership of a variety of different local agencies are kicking off this project of the similar degree to what we're doing in Marin, San Mateo, and Sonoma counties. And hopefully we'll be doing the same things in Santa Clara and Santa Cruz counties, where just in the last 9 months, you can see that it's a large set of funding that is needed. Around $3 million have been brought together through different funding sources, from federal, state, a funding gap of around $500,000 needed for the fine scale mapping. So we're well on our way towards working over the next few years in these two counties now. What's been kicked off so far is that Valley Water has a staff person that's getting out, just started this late spring into summer into early fall. Claire Mallon is one staff person funded through Valley Water to get on the ground to look at particularly riparian vegetation, but also other related vegetation to riparian, to look at what are reference sites for monitoring and restoration of vegetation types in Santa Clara County. So that's one funding, one agency partner that's working on the ground right now to collect vegetation data. And then also the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has put in funding to get staff through the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Partnership. UCSC is another partner of the organization that are, getting people on the ground that just started in the last month, where we kicked off vegetation sampling. And on into next spring and summer will be the data collection. And we hope to collect, I don't remember the exact goal of what our data collection is. I think it's over, I know it's over 500 surveys. We're yet to kind of determine the total number of samples, but we've got to come together as a set of partners to make that final determination. But a few hundred to at least 500 surveys is where we hope to sample over the next 9 to 12 months of time. So this just shows the funding that we've done across all the different tasks. And the main gap is in the fine scale vegetation mapping product that we hope to get the remaining funding. More than half of the funding we've gotten so far. So hopefully through more shaking the trees of those people who could best utilize this mapping information, we hope to work towards the completion of getting funding. And here are the main partners of the project in the Santa Clara and Santa Cruz: the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network, as I said, and then the geospatial folks at Tuckman Geospatial and Cass Green, as well as all these other agencies and CNPS that are working on this project. So that's my talk. Hopefully it was informative.
Very great, Julie. Thanks very much for all that information, and it's just impressive because I've been seeing you talk about vegetation for a while, but so much has happened over the last few years. It's incredible. So
definitely,
thank you for that.
You're welcome.
We had a few questions, not too many, but we got a few. So
okay, great.
Yeah, so we got some technical questions, which is nice. By the way, I noticed I thought that might be Coyote Ridge. Thanks for throwing that one slide in there. Definitely. So once the entire state has been vegetation mapped, and you said 60% or something is done now?
Yes.
Okay. So is there a long-term goal, or how long do you think it'll take to do the state?
A lot of it is really just based on the opportunities that we've been having with the different, local and state and federal agency partners that have really been coming together to see the value of these fine scale maps for a variety of different purposes, whether it's for better, implementing wildlife, management to resource assessment and monitoring, so depends on the region and who's coming together. So I would say, we had this like 10-year goal about 10 years ago, like we're going to map the rest of the state. That did not happen. That was like way too lofty. I was like, that's going to happen in maybe 20 years. So, I mean, one of our state agency colleagues, he's very optimistic. I was like, that's, so I would say that, our hope, I would say in the last 20 years, it's been about 20 years, we've done over 60, percent of the state. I hope in the next 10 years, maybe we'll get the rest done. And then some areas we're even doing remapping. So depending on the agency partner, like as I was saying, Department of Water Resources, they are funding certain project areas to get remapped at a 5 to 10 year cycle. So sometimes there is remapping as well. And that really depends on who has funding for that. But what I would say is that these county level efforts, because of the semi-automated techniques, I think it lends itself to with not a lot of more funding to be able to remap some of these areas over time too.
Right.
What our hope
it
is.
Seems like, especially with the substantial changes from these fires, very intense fires, exactly, and development. So yeah. So that's also a question from Arvind. So do you map only public and pristine areas, or areas invaded by non-native invasives, urban areas, farmlands, ranches? And I think we did see the farmlands and so forth on
so everything gets mapped. So development, and then there might be like, there's a few different categories even within development in the fine scale, because there might be like small little wildlands within developments. And so there's some subcategories even in development. There's different levels in the agricultural. There's different subclasses that get mapped. So yes, even in the agricultural, all of that. So everything gets mapped, whether it's native, non-native, developed, or semi-natural, basically.
But there are agriculture gets also mapped by the state agricultural.
It does. There's this farmlands mapping. What I would say is that they're at a medium scale of mapping, and then when we do these finer scale county level mapping, there's a real difference in what gets mapped at a statewide scale versus a local scale. And that can help in a variety of different reasons, whether it's, to better understand where our farmland resources, how much water is going into these farmland resources. And, so these fine scale maps, even the, open space districts and the agricultural districts, they really value the finer scale maps that are getting produced.
Right. So regarding keeping on that topic, vegetation maps, are those overlined on soil maps? That's one question. And which I know the state also, well, at least they used to map. And so another question was, is soil type, geology, hydrology, aspect, slope, precipitation also part of the data set? And I think you do get some of that.
Yes. So yes, I mean, both qualitatively and quantitatively, yes. I would say that sometimes the soils data can be misleading and helpful depending on, are they environmental drivers like highly saline soils or alkaline soils? Yes, those are high on environmental drivers, for example, or serpentinite soils, for example. So some of those, when they're brought into those machine learning, they basically help show what is predicting the patterning of the plants, because they bring in all the different vegetation surveys, all those data layers, and then they can show what are the predictive value of each of those layers. And it's really fascinating. Mark Tuckman gives us great talk to show, like, for some of those data layers, how much they inform the mapping of the different plant communities. And I would say LIDAR is one of the most important predictors. The aerial imagery, the slope and aspect, definitely, The hydrology sometimes definitely, yes. So all those things that he listed for sure have some
great.
value.
Great. I know our local habitat agency also does serpentine mapping.
Yes, so that serpentine mapping is definitely going right in. It already is. So the staff that are getting out on the ground to do the data collection, they have a lot of those layers on their tablets that they can turn on and off as they go in the field. So like, oh yes, I'm on serpentine, and let's look at, is the vegetation pattern any different on serpentine versus off serpentine? It is really helpful to have those data layers.
So a question about metadata, which is not a question for me. Is the metadata from vegetation community surveys, for example, fire evidence, disturbance type / level, slope aspect, etc., available publicly? If not, is that an eventual goal?
Yeah, so if I'm answering this question right, so those vegetation maps, it really depends on the study area and what are all the attributes. So for example, the Modoc Plateau, where we had all those fine scale level attributes, all of the geodatabase, and that geodatabase has a set of, my internet's a little unstable, so hopefully I'm still on.
You're okay. You gap for a second, but you're all right. Yeah.
Great. The geodatabase has all the polygons and all those attributes per polygon. I wouldn't say that all the vegetation maps that get produced at this fine scale have all those same set of attributes. It really is agency and funding based. So whatever agency decided that was important to them, they wanted to fund those additional attributes. So it's per project base. And so the metadata that is associated with the map file, it will say what those set of attributes are. And so yes, the metadata through that BIOS server, and then even Databasin is another server that has the same, they suck in the same set of geodatabases of the GIS files of the vegetation maps. They would say in the general metadata, what were the attributes, and then the geodatabase of the veg polygons would have all that information.
But they can contact you with questions about specific issues.
Either me or the Department of Fish and Wildlife, because they're a contact for a lot of the geospatial data.
Okay. I went to school before GIS, so some of this is
It's
lost on me.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the need for updating prior vegetation maps that may be 20 plus years old. What are the factors for these changes? I think you've gone over this a little bit. Fire, development, plant disease, etc. Also, I'm thinking about the contrast between old classifications like sycamore alluvial woodland versus various platanus, racemosa, or salix alliances, which may not capture the presence of low abundance tree species. Does that all make sense?
It does. It's a good question. I would still say that, we set some pretty low thresholds for calling certain things riparian, and we use diagnostic species like sycamore or Platanus racemosa. And, we set these thresholds is what we call them, or membership rules for what is this community type versus that community type. So we have a membership rule of when, for example, willow is co-dominating with sycamore, we call it the Sycamore Alliance, not the Willow Alliance. But we set those rules as we go, as we analyze the data and see, how the data sorts out. And then we keep those consistent set of rules across different project areas, assuming that, the data is still saying the same across. And so we still, I would say there's some variability, but I would say that sycamore alluvial woodland, we allow some pretty broad thresholds to still have it called Sycamore Alliance, or the different associations of sycamore. The projects like in the Great Valley, for example, we mapped at the alliance level and not at the association level. So we wouldn't have the different associations of sycamore alluvial woodland, but at least we would have the Sycamore Alliance. And the variation is something that, for the funding, they just couldn't get at, is it sycamore with willow association versus sycamore with grassland association, for example, would be two different associations. Those aren't mapped, but at least the Sycamore Alliance. So yes, I would say that even though there has been some changes in the classification, that one of the changes might be that we've merged some willow vegetation types together to have like a tree willow alliance instead of two separate alliances, for example. So there is some combining, but I wouldn't say we combine sycamore with willow. They're still separate alliances.
Okay, I don't know if you mentioned that is always an association or alliance or whatever that's of interest, because they're it's a threatened threatened group,
Yes.
threatened
Exactly,
ecosystem.
because
So
the flooding regimes have really changed over
yeah,
time. Definitely. Yeah. So
the first part of that question was about updating vegetation maps and factors for those changes: fire, development, plant disease. I don't know.
yeah,
Did we answer that?
yes, I would say that those are some of the primary ones, and anything from flooding regimes changing to grazing regimes changing. There used to be a lot more grazing in some areas, 50 to 100 years ago than there is now in certain areas, actually, believe it or not. And some areas have had much less fire frequency over time, and now we're seeing more frequency over time. So, there's been variations across, decades of time. So I would say that, yes, remapping can help, inform changes over time. But I would say that those are some of the drivers to why there is change over time. Yes.
Great. I just wanted to tell everybody that we had some trouble with our public chat was turned off for some reason. So we're trying to cut and paste your questions into the public chat. So
okay.
Sorry about that, everybody. We'll get always some bumps.
Well, thanks everyone for sticking in a little bit after 9 o'clock. My goodness.
If you can, oh yeah, we're serious hardcore here. A couple more questions if you can manage.
I'm here for you.
Okay, good, excellent. We appreciate your time very much. Well, Santa Clara County, you mentioned the program that you're going to be coming up that you're starting to develop. So the eastern side substantially burned during the SCU fire. That and it's mostly private land, private ranches. Are you planning to also include that area?
Yes. So, county is a whole county. So right now, because they only have a little bit over half of the funding for the fine scale mapping, if they don't get the rest of the funding, they will not map that part of the county because they want to map what's called the the Santa Cruz Mountains, because it's the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network that is like the main vehicle for the collaboration. So they're going to make sure that the Santa Cruz Mountains is mapped first. But as long as the rest of the funding comes through over the next 2 years or so, hopefully the entire county, including whether it's public or private, will get mapped. And over time, as we develop relationships with the private, landowners, hopefully then we'll be able to get access over the next, 3 to 6 to 9 months to get on the ground too, to collect data in those further flung areas.
There's a lot of rare and interesting plants on that side of our
so I would say, if your chapter knows, some contacts, to please let us know. There's a new staff person that just got hired in the last few weeks. I think she got hired in September. And so she working through the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. She works, they're based out of the RCD, the San Mateo RCD. So she's hired through the RCD. And then the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, who has been really instrumental in the Marin San Mateo County projects, they lended their staff person to kind of help kick off these projects. So he's been kind of pulling together, landowner contacts. And so if you guys have certain contacts that of friendly landowners, that's that next step over the next 3 to 6 to 9 months. We really need, to get on the ground and know who's friendly enough to let us out and learn more about some of these areas that we haven't ever gotten out on the ground.
Great. So there's a question also about the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority, which is a land agency. I think, now they have the Coyote Ridge Open Space Preserve. They have funds projects through Measure Q grant program. Have you applied for funding from them?
I doubt we have. So that's great to hear that they have a measure. I know that they did provide a small amount of funding. I'd have to look up what that is for the fine scale mapping. But to me, I kind of feel like knowing how much Sonoma County Ag and Open Space District put in for that map that they helped fund for Sonoma County, I kind of feel like the Open Space Authority for Santa Clara County, I feel like they should be hopefully supporting this fine scale mapping more than they currently have.
Okay, well, now you've said that publicly, so we'll see what happens.
I hope that, because I think that this will inform, a longer term,
right.
Management effort and conservation effort, that we all hope to continue for the next, many years to come,
Yeah.
you know,
I think we have about two more questions here, if you can
yeah,
manage
sure.
it. Okay. Is there a move to standardize vegetation community types between CNPS/CDFW and various habitat community plans, for example, East Contra Costa or Santa Clara Valley habitat plans? Since recognized communities and those HCPs don't sync terribly well with the MCV alliances and associations.
It's a great question. What I would say is on the planning phases of HCP and CCPs, they're usually coarser scale. And then as they move towards the later implementation phases, that's where I've seen then they start doing the finer scale mapping. And it's all about those people rattling the cages and saying that this isn't adequate for the longer term conservation and management planning. And like, for example, we did this pilot project this was 15 plus years ago, where there was already an HCP in, let's say, like Western Riverside County, and then the same thing for Orange County, where they had these coarser to medium scale maps. They didn't really meet our state standard yet, and then in the implementation phase they wrote and received grants that utilized our state standards. So I would say that it would be hopefully as they see the benefit, we can work towards the remaining rest of the Bay Area counties, right?
Yeah, I think so. Important. Okay, great. Maybe one or two more. What field software or mobile applications are being implemented in the field to collect data?
Good question. What we use right now is Esri-based products. We use Arc Collector, and we find that is really, while it takes some GIS skills, you've got to have a real GIS savvy person. If you have that type of person to be able to load in and load up on their ArcGIS Online, which we have through CNPS, we've got a number of licenses that are provided to us, and we renew our licenses, and they're like, I can't remember, we get a certain number of licenses per year that then allow us to also use Arc Collector. And then we can help different people kind of like, there's a learning curve to utilizing it. But once you reach that learning curve and we've got a set of protocols, then that's what we use. But there's other mobile phone based apps, but that's what we use, because whether you're on a smartphone or a tablet, what's nice about it is you can preload imagery, soils, geology, pre-existing vegetation maps, like we can load in 20 different layers and then turn them on and off as we go and do our field work. And then we've got a geodatabase that we have standard set of lookup tables that we use. So that's what we use in the field. And then back in the office, it's Esri based, and then there a lot of other sophisticated techniques that I don't even know about for the geospatial companies, but Esri based products for us, at least for field based stuff.
Great. I guess my interest in this also is conservation. When we do conservation for CNPS, and there's projects and documents that are put out and they have vegetation mentioned, maybe rare vegetation types, sort of how to respond to that. So we could ask, chapters could ask you questions about vegetation types that we might see in documents that are affecting our chapter areas.
Definitely. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And sometimes those are a little over.
Or just to ask, like, was this even adequate? Like, you could just say, here's what they depicted. Is that even adequate? Like, sometimes you might know and sometimes you might not know. But I would say our conservation staff, Nick Jensen, used to work on our vegetation program. So he could pretty easily answer whether or not he thinks that was adequately done.
Okay.
But if not Nick, us for sure too. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'm really happy to see that there's no other questions, folks. I can ask my co-host.
That was an engaged audience. You guys are amazing.
Okay, great. Well, we got some thanks rolling in too, and I know that those who have stuck through appreciate it very much. We have a few folks working there, so thank you very much for this work you've been doing for us. You must be with CNPS about 18 years now, or I remember when
2021 will be my 20th year.
Great. Well, we're really happy. I think this is important to have this program too, because I think a lot of our members who may have come in through gardening or something like that may not realize the vegetation program exists and how much work you've been doing and how important this data is to collect. So I'm really glad because I have a note from Peter. Peter says, California is very large. Its habitats are very threatened by multiple agents. CNPS is very small. Julie has described a huge amount of work, labor, skills, knowledge, but it still seems not to be scaling. What is the vision for scaling to the task and needs? I guess still not scaling to the statewide needs. I'm not sure I understand that entirely, Peter, but that's a pretty big question. So,
yeah, I mean, that's a great, scaling to the task. I mean, gosh, can we just have, a few million more dollars, 20 million? Sure, then we can scale up across the rest of the state.
Okay, everybody put it in their legacy donations to CNPS.
But I mean, that's not just for us, I mean, there are so many partners. It is a collaboration, now that we've been working on these county level, I mean, it takes so many different skill sets.
Yeah.
And set of partners and collaborators that it's a melding of a lot of different people's knowledge base, skill sets, analysis techniques. I'm only one of many, I would say.
That's great. Well, I just hope the budgets will allow, they're being dampened right now in the governmental.
They really
I hope it allows some budget in the future for all of the CNPS's work,
I know.
For grants.
We're familiar with the ups and downs. Honestly, it's always been a roller coaster. We're an NGO, we know that. And, we go through, 5 years where federal agencies are really got, strong support, and then they have no funding. And then we go towards, the state or local agency. So it's always a roller coaster. We're just trying to keep positive, and I don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. It's a little bit dire, but all I can do is stay positive that we've got amazing chapters like you to, and a lot of local agencies and state agencies that see the value of this work, that we can just continue, slowly but surely.
Yes. Well, I hope we can get involved a little bit in the future with this.
So. Maybe we can get out on the ground. What I was hoping, is that we could, what I was saying with that intern that we have in the Mendocino coast, at some point, maybe we can get on the ground and do some physically distanced, targeting of rare plant community sampling in core areas in Santa Clara County. That's what I would hope for the spring, is planting a seed for you all.
Yes, here we go. Yes, please. Let's do some group things.
I loved going out in the field with you, Judy, a long time ago. We got to get some of you guys back out.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I guess we can wrap it up at this point, unless there's anything else. Julie is reachable at J Evans at cnps.org, JEVENS. EVENS.
You got it.
And I want to thank everybody for attending, and we'll have this up on YouTube after a while, and look forward to our next programs, and check our website and come to our plant sale on Saturday again, if you make sure and order as soon as you can, because the slots will be filling up. So thanks very much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.